Hey y'all, Carpetbagger here, coming to you live from the south, more specifically, a very rainy cemetery in Laurinburg, North Carolina. And I'm here to visit one grave in particular, and that is the grave of Concito Farmica. If you notice, died April 28th, 1911. He was 23 years old, but he wasn't buried until September 30th, 1972. What is going on here? So for those 60 years that he went unburied, Concito was actually known by a different name. He was known as Spaghetti the Mummy. Spaghetti the Mummy. I'll say that one more time. Spaghetti the Mummy. So anyways, Concito was a Italian-American traveling carnival worker. And when the carnival came to town here, he was involved in a bit of a scuffle. And that scuffle involved him being bashed over the head with a tent stake and killed. He would wind up in the local mortuary where he would be embalmed. Apparently his father actually traveled down here, paid the embalming fee, said he would return later to pay for the funeral, and never showed back up. So they did what any good funeral home would do, and they put him on display, and they let people come and visit the mummy. And why is it called spaghetti? Well, because he was an Italian gentleman, and his name was difficult to pronounce, so they gave him what they felt was an appropriate Italian name of Spaghetti. He became known as Spaghetti the Mummy. Now this would last, like I said, 60 years. 60 years until the 1970s. He was on display at a local funeral home until some Italians from New York felt this was disrespectful, felt that having a dead Italian hanging up in a funeral home like a piñata and calling him spaghetti of all things, that was disrespectful to Italians. So they demanded that he be buried. And the funeral home actually, this group of Italians in New York, the funeral home actually wanted them to pay for the storage of the body for the past 60 years. But they were able to work things out, and here we have Concito, no longer, it doesn't say spaghetti on his grave. I was wondering if it was going to say spaghetti. Concito Farmica, buried here. Supposedly, the Italians also placed 2 tons of cement under the ground to ensure that he would remain in the earth for the rest of eternity. Now, oddly enough, this idea of a funeral home mummy is not exclusive to here in Lawrenceburg, North Carolina. I've actually been to the grave of a different funeral home mummy, Charles Speedy Atkins, and that's in Paducah, Kentucky. He was a African-American. He apparently drowned while fishing and was turned over to the funeral home. He didn't have any family that could pay for him to have a proper burial. So the guy at the mortuary, who apparently was some sort of mad scientist, did some experimental embalming process on him that allegedly kept him looking exactly how he did in life, except it didn't really. He looked like a horrific zombie monster. But anyways, he was kept on display, just like spaghetti. Very, very similar story. It was around the same amount of time, too. I think he was on display for 50 years. They called him Speedy, Charles Speedy Atkins. And depends on where you hear the source of why they call him Speedy. Some say Speedy was actually a name he had in life, because he was a speedy tobacco farmer. He could pick tobacco really fast. Or some just said that Speedy was just a joke, because as a mummy, he wasn't very speedy. But probably the most notorious funeral home mummy is Elmer McCrudy. Now, Elmer McCrudy was actually an Old West outlaw who was killed in a gunfight, so really exciting right off the bat. Of course, you know, outlaws don't have families or whatnot, so once again, he was covered or embalmed in arsenic and put on display and put in a funeral home. So yeah, this is, who would even think of like putting a dead body on display in modern times. Hey everybody, look at this corpse. Like, what is exactly the appeal in that? That's like ghoulishness to an absolute extreme. But anyways, I digress. So what happened was, apparently, he actually was sent out on a sideshow. The notorious Elmer McCrudy was sent out in a sideshow where people would buy tickets to see his dead body, and they would take their tickets and put them in Elmer's open mouth. Now, two of Elmer's family members would show up at the circus, say that they were appalled, and demand that they be given back their relative. And the circus was embarrassed, gave Elmer back, but it turns out these weren't family members. They were grifters. They worked for an opposing sideshow, and they put Elmer on display. And Elmer would go around for years and years and years, being passed around to different sideshows, different circuses. And that takes us to the 1970s, which seems to be a popular time for funeral mummies to no longer be on display. So they were filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were using an old carnival attraction in Los Angeles. It was like a haunted house. And they were filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and one of the crew members bonked into this Halloween prop. It was a body hanging from a noose by its neck, and when he bumped into it, its arm fell off. They thought it was just a prop. They pick it up, there's a bone sticking out of it. It is not a prop, it is a live human being. See, Elmer had been passed around so many times, and you know, he's got bumped up and damaged. They would repair him here, repair him there, to the point where the fact that he was actually a human being and a real corpse was actually lost to time. It was just assumed he was a dummy or a prop at some point. So after that horrifying encounter, Elmer was finally laid to rest. I think all our funeral home mummies are currently in the ground. Actually, that's not true. There is a set of funeral home mummies that still exists outside of the ground. I think that's in Philippi, West Virginia. There was two asylum patients, two people that were put in this asylum that were mummified upon death, and I think they're still in a museum in Philippi, West Virginia. So that's gonna have to be a road trip for me. But until then, please like, subscribe, and share. If you want to see other places I visited, please check down in the link in the description. I have an interactive map. And if you'd like to buy a t-shirt, I have a link down there as well. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can do that. A donation of $3 or more will get you a postcard. For now, this one's in the grave. I mean bag.